Strategies for finding your life's task. The misery that oppresses you lies not in your profession, but in yourself. What man in the world would not find his situation intolerable if he chooses a craft, an art, indeed any form of life, without expressing an inner calling? Whoever is born with a talent, or to a talent, must surely find in that the most pleasuring of occupations. Everything on this earth has its difficult sides. Only some inner drive pleasure, love, can help us overcome obstacles, prepare a path, and lift us out of the narrow circle in which others thread us out of their anguished, miserable existences. Joan Wolfgang van Gogh. It might seem that connecting to something as personal as your inclinations and life's tasks would be relatively simple and natural once you recognize their importance. But in fact, it's the opposite. It requires a good deal of planning and strategizing to do it properly, since so many obstacles will present themselves. The following 5 strategies, illustrated by stories of masters, are designed to deal with the main obstacles in your path over time. The voices of others infecting you, fighting over limited resources, choosing false paths, getting stuck in the past, and losing your way. Pay attention to all of them, because you will almost inevitably encounter each one in some form. Number 1. Return to your origins, the primal inclination strategy. For masters, their inclination often presents itself to them with remarkable clarity in childhood. Sometimes it comes in the form of a simple object that triggers a deep response. When Albert Einstein, who was born 1879 and died 1955, was 5, his father gave him a compass as a present. Instantly, the boy was transfixed by the needle, which changed directions as he moved the compass about. The idea that there was some kind of magnetic force that operated on this needle, invisible to the eyes, touched him to the core. What if there was other forces? What if there was other forces in the world, equally invisible yet equally powerful, ones that were undiscovered or not understood? For the rest of his life, all of his interests and ideas would revolve around the simple question of hidden forces and fields. And he would often think back to the compass that had sparked the initial fascination. When Marie Curie, born 1867 and died 1934, the future discoverer of radium, was 4 years old, she wandered into her father's study and stood transfixed before a glass case that contained all kinds of laboratory instruments for chemistry and physics experiments. She would return to that room again and again to stare at the instruments, imagining all sorts of experiments she could conduct with these tubes and measuring devices. Years later, when she entered a real laboratory for the first time and did some experiments herself, she reconnected immediately with her childhood obsession. She knew she had found her vocation. When future film director Ingmar Bergman, born 18 and died 2007, was 9 years old. His parents gave his brother for Christmas a cinematographer, a moving picture machine with strips of film that projected simple scenes. He had to have it for himself. He traded his own toys to get it, and once it was in his possession, he hurried into a large closet and watched the flickering images it projected on the wall. It seemed like something had magically come to life each time he turned it on. To produce such magic would become his lifelong obsession. Sometimes this inclination becomes clear through a particular activity that brings with it a feeling of heightened power. As a child, Martha Graham, born 1894, died 1991, felt intensively frustrated by her ability to make others understand her in a deep way. Words seemed inadequate. Then one day she saw her first dance performance. The lead dancer had a way of expressing certain emotions through movement. It was visceral, not verbal. She started dance lessons soon thereafter and immediately understood her vocation. Only when dancing she could feel alive and expressive. Years later, she would go on to invent a whole new form of dance and, and revolutionize the genre. Sometimes it is not an object or activity, but rather something in culture that sparks a deep connection. The contemporary anthropologist, linguist Daniel Everett, born 1951, grew up on the California-Mexico border in a cowboy town. From a very early age, he found himself drawn to Mexican culture around him. Everything about it fascinated him. The sound of the words spoken by the migrant workers, the food, the manners, they were so different from the Anglo world. He immersed himself as much as he could in their language and culture. This would transform into a lifelong interest in the other, the diversity of cultures on the planet, and what that means about our evolution. And sometimes one's true inclinations can be revealed through an encounter with an actual master. As a young boy growing up in North California, John Coltrane, born 1926, died 1967, felt different and strange. He was much more serious than his schoolmates. He experienced emotional and spiritual longings he did not know how to verbalize. He drifted into music more as a hobby, talking up the saxophone and playing in his high school band. Then a few years later, he saw the great jazz saxophonist Charlie Bird Parker, perform live, and the sounds Parker produced touched Coltrane to the core. Something primal and personal came through Parker's saxophone, a voice deep within. Coltrane suddenly saw the means for expressing his uniqueness and giving a voice to his own spiritual longings. He began to practice the instrument with such intensity that within a decade he transformed himself into perhaps the greatest jazz artist of his era. You must understand the following. In order to master a field, you must love the subject and feel a profound connection to it. Your interest must transcend in the field itself and border on the right religious. For Einstein, it was not physics, but a fascination with invisible forces that governed the universe. For Bergman, it was not film, but the sensation of creating and animating life. For Coltrane, it was not music, but giving voice to powerful emotions. These childhood attractions are hard to put into words and are more like sensations that of deep wonder, sensual pleasure, power, and heightened awareness. The importance of recognizing these preverbal inclinations is that they are clear indications of an attraction that is not infected by the desires of other people. They are not something embedded in you by your parents, which come with a more superficial connection, something more verbal and conscious. Coming instead from somewhere deeper, they can only be your own reflections of your unique chemistry. As you become more sophisticated, you often lose touch with the signals from your primal core. They can be buried beneath all of the other subjects you have studied. Your power and future can depend on reconnecting with this core and returning to your origins. You must dig for the signs of such inclination in your earliest years. Look for its traces in visceral reactions to something simple, a desire to repeat an activity that you never tried of, that you never tired of, a subject that simulated an unusual degree of curiosity, feelings of power attached to particular actions. It is already there within you. You have nothing to create. You merely need to dig and re-find what has been buried inside of you all along. If you reconnect with this core at any age, some element of that primitive attraction will spark back to life, indicating a path that can ultimately become your life's task. Number 2, occupy the perfect niche, the Darwinian strategy. A. As a child growing up in Madras, India in the late 1950s, V.S. Ramachandran knew he was different. He was not interested in sports or any other usual pursuits of boys in his age. He loved to read about science. In his loneliness, he would often wander along the beach. As soon he became fascinated by the incredible variety of seashells that washed upon the shore. He began to collect them and study the subject in detail. It gave him a feeling of power. Here was a field. He had all to himself. Nobody in school could ever know as much as he did about shells. Soon he was drawn to the strongest varieties of seashells, such as a xenophora, an organism that collects discarded shells and uses them for camouflage. In a way, he was like the xenophora, an anomaly. In nature, these anomalies often serve a larger evolutionary purpose. They can lead to the occupation of new ecological niches, offering a greater chance of survival. Could Ramachandran say the same about his own strangleness. Over the years, he transferred his boyhood interest into other subjects: human anatomical abnormalities, peculiar phenomena in chemistry, and so on. His father, fearing that the young man would end up in some esoteric field of research, convinced him to enroll in medical school. There he would be exposed to all sides of science, and he would come out of it with a practical skill. Ramachandran complied. Although the studies in medical school interested him, after a while he grew restless. He disliked all of the road to learning. He wanted to experiment and discover, not memorize. He began to read all kinds of science journals and books that were not on the reading list. One such book was Eye and Brain by visual neuroscientist Richard Gregory. What particularly intrigued him were experiments on optical illusions and blind spots, anomalies in the visual system that could explain something about how the brain itself functioned. Stimulated by this book, he conducted his own experiments, and the results of which he managed to get published in a prestigious journal, which in turn led to an invitation to study visual neuroscience in the graduate department in Cambridge University. Excited by this chance to pursue something more suited to his interest, Ramachandran accepted the invitation. After a few months at Cambridge, however, he realized that he did not fit in this environment. In his boyhood dreams, science was the great romantic adventure, an almost religious-like quest for the truth. But at Cambridge, for the students and faculty, it seemed to be more like a job. You put in your hours. You contribute some small piece to statistical analysis, and that was that. He soldiered on, finding his own interest within the department, and completed his degree. A few years later, he was hired as an assistant professor in the visual psychology at the University of California at San Diego. As had happened so many times before, after a few years his mind began to drift to yet another subject, this time to the study of the brain itself. He became intrigued with the phenomenon of phantom limbs, people who had an arm or leg amputated and still yet feel a paralyzing pain in the missing limb. He proceeded to conduct experiments on phantom limb subjects. These experiments led to some exciting discoveries about the brain itself, as well as a novel way to relieve such patients of their pain. Suddenly, the feeling of not fitting in, of restlessness, was gone. Studying anonymous neurological disorders would be the subject to which he could devote the rest of his life. It opened up questions that fascinated him about the evolution of consequences, the origin of language, and so on. It was as if he had come full circle to the days of collecting the rarest forms of seashells. This was a niche he had all to himself, one he could command for years to come, that corresponded to his deepest inclinations and would serve best the cause of scientific advancement. For Yoku Matsuka, childhood was a period of confusion and blur. Growing up in Japan in the 1970s, everything seemed laid out for her in advance. The school system would funnel into a field that was appropriate for girls, and the possibilities were rather narrow. Her parents, believing in the importance of sports in her development, pushed her into competitive swimming at a very early age. They also had her take up the piano. For other children in Japan, it may have been comforting to see their lives directed in such a fashion, but for Yoku, it was painful. She was interested in all kinds of subjects, particularly math and science. She liked sports, but not swimming. She had no idea what she wanted to become or how she could possibly fit into such a regimented world. At the age of 11, she finally asserted herself. She had had enough of the swimming and wanted to take up tennis. Her parents agreed to her wishes. Being intensely competitive, she had great dreams of herself as a tennis player. But she was starting out in the sport rather late in life. To make up for the lost time, she would have to undergo an almost impossibly rigorous practice schedule. She traveled outside Tokyo for training and so would her homework on the ride back at night. Often having to stand up in the crowded car, she would crack open her math and physics books and work out the equations. She loved solving puzzles, and in doing this homework, her mind would become so completely absorbed in the problems that she was barely aware of the time passing. In a strange way, it was similar to the sensation she felt in the tennis court, a deep focus where nothing could distract her. In the few free moments on the train, Yoku would think about her future. Science and sports were the two great interests in her life. In them, she would express all of the different sides of her character. Her love for competing, working with her hands, moving gracefully, analyzing and solving problems. In Japan, you had to choose a career that was generally quite specialized. Whatever she chose would require sacrificing her other interests, which depressed her to no end. One day, she daydreamed about inventing a robot that she could play tennis with her. Inventing and playing against such a robot would satisfy all of her different sides of her character. But it was only a dream. Although she had risen through the ranks to become one of the top tennis prospects in Japan, she quickly realized that this was not to be her future. In practice, no one could beat her, but in competition, she was often freeze up, overthink the situation, and lose inferior players. She also suffered some debilitating injuries. She would have to focus on academics and not on sports. After attending a tennis academy in Florida, she convinced her parents to let her stay in the States to apply to the University of California at Berkeley. At Berkeley, she could not decide on a major. Nothing seemed to quite fit her wide-ranging interests. For lack of anything better, she settled on electrical engineering. One day, she confided to a professor in her department about her youthful dream to build a robot to play tennis with her. Much to her surprise, the professor did not laugh, but instead invited her to join his graduate lab for robotics. Her work there showed so much promise that she was later admitted to graduate school at MIT, where she joined the Artificial Intelligence Lab of Robotics. Pioneer Rodney Brooks. They were developing a robot with artificial intelligence, and Matsuka volunteered to design the hand and arms. Ever since she was a child, she had pondered her own hands while she was playing tennis, or the piano, or while scribbling out math equations. The human hand was a miracle of design. Although this was not exactly sports, she would be working with her hands to construct the hand, finding at least something that suited a larger range of her interests. She worked night and day on building a new kind of robotic limb, one that possessed as much as possible the delicate grasping power of human hand. Her design dazzled Brooks. It was years ahead of anything anyone had ever developed. Feeling that there was a critical lack in her knowledge, she decided to gain an additional degree in neuroscience. If she could better understand the connection between the hand and the brain, she could design a prosthetic limb that would feel and respond like a human hand. She continued this process, adding new fields of science to her resume, culminating in the creation of a completely new field that she would dub neurorobotics, the design of robots that possess simulated versions of human neurology, bringing them closer to life itself. Forging this field would bring her great success in science and put her in the ultimate position of power, the ability to freely combine all of her interests. The career world is like an ecological system. People occupy particular fields within which they must compete for resources and survival. The more people there are crowded into a space, the harder it becomes to thrive there. Working in such a field will tend to wear you out as you struggle to get at attention, to play the political games, to win scarce resources for yourself. You spend so much time at these games that you have little time left over for true mastery. You are seduced into such fields because you see others there making a living, thriving in the familiar path. You're not aware of how difficult such a life can be. The game you want to play is different. To instead find the niche in the ecology that you can dominate. It is never a simple process to find such a niche. It requires patience and a particular strategy. In the beginning, you choose a field that roughly corresponds to your interests. Magical, electrical engineering. From there, you can go in one of two directions. The first is Ramachandran's path. From within your chosen field, you'll look for the side paths that particularly attract you. In this case, the science of perception and optics. When it's possible, you make a move to the narrower field. You consume this process until you eventually hit upon a totally unoccupied niche. The narrower, the better. In some ways, this niche corresponds to your uniqueness, much as Ramachandran's particular form of neurology corresponds to his own primal sense of feeling like an exception. The second one is Matsuka's path. Once you have mastered your first field, robotics, you look for other subjects or skills that you can conquer neuroscience on your own time if necessary. You can now combine this added field of knowledge into the original one, perhaps creating a new field, or at least making novel connections between them. You continue this process as long as you wish. In Matsuka's case, she never stops expanding. Ultimately, you create a field that is uniquely your own. This second version fits in well with a culture where its information is so widely available and in which connecting ideas is a form of power. In either direction, you have found a niche that is not crowded with competitors. You have freedom to roam, to pursue particular questions that interest you. You set your own agenda and command these resources available to this niche. Unbundered by overwhelming competition and politicking, you have the time and space to bring to flower your life's task. Number 3. Avoid the false path. The rebellion strategy. In 1760, at the age of 4, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart took up the piano under his father's instruction. It was Wolfgang who asked to start lessons at the precocious age. His sister, aged 7, had already started on the instrument. Perhaps it was partly out of sibling rivalry that he had taken such initiative. Seeing the attention and love that his sister received for her playing and wanting it for himself. At the first few months of practice, his father, Leopold, a talented player, composer, and teacher himself, would see that Wolfgang was exceptional, most strange for his age. The boy loved to practice. At night, his parents had to drag him away from the piano. He began to compose his own pieces at the age of 5. Soon Leopold took this prodigy and his sister on the road to perform in all capitals of Europe. Wolfgang dazzled the loyal audiences for whom he performed. He played with assurance and could improvise all kinds of clever melodies. He was like a precious toy. His father was now earning a nice income for the family. As more and more courts wanted to see the child genius in action. As the patriarch of the family, Leopold demanded total obedience from his children, even though it was now young Wolfgang who was essentially supporting them all. Wolfgang willingly submitted. He owed everything to his father. But as he entered adolescence, something else stirred within him. Was it playing the piano that he enjoyed, or simply attracting all the attention? He felt confused. After so many years composing music, he was finally devoted to his own style, and yet his father insisted that he focus on writing more controversial pieces that pleased the royal audiences and brought the family money. The city of Salzburg, where they lived, was provincial and bourgeois. In general, he yearned for something else, to be on his own, which with each passing year, Wolfgang felt increasingly stiff. Finally, in 1777, the father allowed Wolfgang now 21, to leave for Paris, accompanied by his mother. There he must try to gain a prominent position as a conductor, so that he could continue supporting his family. But Wolfgang did not find Paris to his liking. The job he was offered seemed beneath his talents. And then his mother fell ill, were there and died on the way back home. The trip was a disaster in all possible ways. Wolfgang returned to Salzburg, chastened and prepared to submit to his father's will. He accepted a rather uninteresting position as the court organist, but he could not completely suppress his unease. He despaired of spending his life in his mediocre position, writing music to please these petty provincials. At one point, he wrote to his father, "I am a composer. I neither can go, and neither can nor ought to bury the talent for composition which God in his goodness has so richly endowed me." Leopold reacted to the frequent complaints of his son with anger, reminding him of the debt he owed for all of the training he had received, and all the expenses his father had incurred in all their endless travels. Finally, in a flash, it came to Wolfgang. It was never really the piano it was his love, nor even music per se. He did not enjoy performing before others like a puppet. It was composing that he was destined for. But more than that, he had an intense love for the theater. He wanted to compose operas. That was his true voice. He would never realize this if he remained in Salzburg. It was his father who represented more than an obstacle. He was in fact ruining his life, his health, his confidence. It was not just about money. His father was actually jealous of his son's talents, and whether consequently or not, he was trying to stifle his progress. Wolfgang tried to take a step, however painful, before it was too late. On a trip to Vienna in 1781, Wolfgang made the fateful decision to stay. He would never return to Salzburg. As if Wolfgang had broken some great taboo, his father could never forgive him for this. His son had abandoned the family. The rift between them would never be repaired. Feeling that he had lost so much time under his father's thumb, Wolfgang composed at a furious pace. His most famous operas and compositions pouring out of him, as if he were possessed. A false path in life is generally something we were attached to go for the wrong reasons. Money, fame, attention, and so on. If it is attention we need, we often experience all kinds of empathies inside that we're hoping to fill with the false love of public approval, because the field we choose does not correspond with our deepest inclinations. We rarely find the fulfillment that we crave. Our work suffers for this, and the attention we may have gotten in the beginning starts to fade, a painful process. If it is money and comfort that dominate our decisions, we're most often acting out of anxiety and the need to please our parents. They might steer us towards something lucrative out of care and concern, but lurking underneath this can be something else, perhaps a bit of envy that we have more freedom than they had when they were young. Your strategy must be twofold. First, to realize as early as possible that you have chosen your career for the wrong reasons, before your confidence takes a hit. And second, to actively rebel against those forces that have pushed you away from your true path. Scoff at the need for attention and approval. They will lead you to astray. Feel some anger and resentment at the parental forces that want you to foist upon you an alien vocation. It is a healthy part of your development to follow a path independent of your parents and to establish your own identity. Let your sense of rebellion fill you with an energy and purpose. If it is the father figure, the Leopold Mozart that is blocking your path, you must slay him and clear the way. Number 4. Let go of the past. The adaptation strategy. From the time he was born in 1960, Freddie Roach was groomed to be a boxing champion. His father had been a professional fighter himself, and his mother a boxing judge. Freddie's older brother began learning the sport at an early age, and when Freddie was 6, he was promptly taken to the local gym in South Boston to begin a rigorous apprenticeship in the sport. He trained with a coach several hours a day, 6 days a week. At the age of 15, he felt like he was burnt out. He made more and more excuses to avoid going to the gym. One day, his mother sensed this and said to him, "Why don't you fight anyway? Why do you fight anyway? You just get hit all the time. You can't fight." He was used to the consistent criticism from his father and brothers, but not to hear such a frank assessment from his mother had a pressing effect. Clearly, she saw his older brother as the one destined for greatness. Now Freddie, determined that he would somehow prove her wrong, he returned to the training regimen with a vengeance. He discovered within his training regimen. He discovered within himself a passion for practice and discipline. He enjoyed the sensation of getting better, the trophies that began to pile up, and more than anything, the fact that he could now actually beat his brother. His love for the sport was rekindled. As Freddie now showed the most promise of the brothers, his father took him to Las Vegas to help further his career. Then at the age of 18, he met the legendary coach Eddie Fudge and began to train under him. It all looked very promising. He was chosen for the United States boxing team and began to climb up the ranks. Before long, however, he hit another wall. He would learn the most effective maneuvers from Fudge and practice them to perfection. But in all actual bout, it was another story. As soon as he got hit in the ring, he, however, reverted to fighting instinctually. His emotions would get the better of him. His fights would turn into brawls over many rounds, and he would often lose. After a few years, Fudge told Roach it was time to retire. But boxing had been his own life. Retire and do what? He continued to fight and to lose until finally he could see the writing on the wall and retired. He took a job in telemarketing and began to drink heavily. Now he hated the sport. He had given it so much and had nothing to show for his efforts. Almost in spite of himself, one day he returned to Futch's gym to watch his friend Virgil Hill spar with the boxer about to fight for a title. Both fighters trained under Fudge, but there was nobody in Hill's corner helping him. So Freddie brought him water and gave him advice. He showed up at the following day to help Hill again, and soon became a regular at Futch's gym. He was not being paid, so he kept his telemarketing job. But something in him smelled opportunity, and he was desperate. He showed up on time and stayed later than anyone else. Knowing Futch's techniques so well, he could teach them to all fighters. His responsibilities had begun to grow. In the back of his mind, he could not shake his resentment of boxing, and he questioned how long he could keep this up. It was a dog-eat-dog career, and trainers rarely lasted very long in the business. Would this turn into yet another routine in which he would endlessly repeat the same exercises he had learned from Fudge? A part of him yearned to return to fighting. At least fighting was not so predictable. One day, Virgil Hill showed him a technique he had picked up from some Cuban fighters. Instead of working with a punching bag, they mostly trained with the coach, who wore large padded mitts. Standing in the ring, the fighters had sparred with the coach and practiced their punches. Roach, tired of it, tried it with Hill, and his eyes lit up. It brought back into the ring. But there was something else. Boxing, he felt, had become stale, as had its training methods. In his mind, he saw a way to adapt the mitt work for more than just punching practice. It would be a way for a trainer to diverse an entire strategy in the ring and demonstrate it to his fighter in real time. It could revolutionize and revitalize the sport itself. Roach began to develop this with the stable of fighters that now had trained. He instructed them in maneuvers that were so much more fluid and strategic. Soon he left Fudge to work on his own. He quickly established a reputation for preparing his boxers better than anyone else, and within a few years he rose to and become the most successful trainer in his generation. In dealing with your career, it is inevitable changes. You must think in the following way. You're not tied to a particular position. Your loyalty is not to a career or a company. You're committed to your life's task, to giving it a full expression. It is up to you to find a guide to guide it correctly. It is not up to others to protect you or help you. You're on your own. Change is inevitable, particularly in such a revolutionary moment as ours. Since you are on your own, it is up for you to foresee the changes going on right now in your profession. You must adapt your life's task to these circumstances. You do not hold on to past ways of doing things, because that will ensure you fall behind and suffer for it. You're flexible and always looking to adapt. If change is forced upon you, as it was for Freddie Roach, you must resist the temptation to overreact or feel sorry for yourself. Roach instinctively found his way back to the ring because he understood that what he loved was not boxing per se, but competitive sports and strategizing. Thinking in this way, he could adapt his inclinations to a new direction within boxing. Like Roach, you don't want to abandon the skill you and experience you've gained, but you find a new way to apply them. Your eye is on the future, not the past. Often such creative readjustments lead to a superior path for us. We're shaking out of our complicity and forced to resist where we're headed. Remember, your life's task is a living, breathing organism. The moment you rigidly follow a plan set in your youth, you lock yourself into a position, and the times you ruthlessly pass you by. Finding your way back, the life or death strategy. As a very young child, Buckminster Fuller, born 1895, died 1983, knew what he experienced the world differently than others. He was born with extreme nearsightedness. Everything around him was a blur, so his other senses developed to compensate for this, particularly touch and smell. Even after was prescribed glasses at the age of 5, he continued to perceive the world around him with more than just his eyes. He had a tactile form of intelligence. Fuller was an extremely resourceful child. He once invited a new kind of ore to help him propel him across the lakes in mine, where he spent the summers delivering mail. Its design was modeled after the motivation of jellyfish, which he had observed and studied. He could envision the dynamics of their movement with more than his eyes. He felt the moment. He reproduced this motion of his newfangled ore, and it functioned beautifully. During such summers, he would dream of another interesting inventions. These would be his life's work, its destiny. Being different, however, had its painful side. He had no patience for the usual forms of education. Although he was very bright and had been admitted to Harvard University, he could not adapt to its strict style of learning. He skipped classes, began to drink, and led a rather bohemian lifestyle. The officials at Harvard expelled him twice, the second time for good. After that, he bounced from job to job. He worked at a metal packing plant, and then during World War I, he secured a good position in the Navy. He had an incredible feel for machines and how their parts worked in concert. But he was restless and could not stay too long in one place. After the war, he had a wife and a child to support, and despairing of ever being able to care for them properly, he decided to take a high-paying position as a sales manager. He worked hard, did a decent job, but after 3 months the company folded. He had found the work extremely unsatisfying, but it seemed that such jobs were all could expect from life. Finally, a few months Finally, a few months later, a chance appeared out of nowhere. His father-in-law had invented a way of producing materials for houses that would end up making them more durable and better insulated and at a much lower cost. But the father would not find investors or anyone willing to help him set up a business. Fuller thought his idea was brilliant. He had always been interested in housing and architecture, so he offered to take a charge of implanting his new technology. He put everything he could into the effort and was even able to improve one of the materials to be used. Fuller's father-in-law supported his work, and together they formed a stockade building system. Money from his investors, mostly family members, allowed them to open factories. But the company struggled. The technology was too new for them to open factories. Too new and radical. And the technology was too new and radical. And Fuller was too much of a purist to compromise this desire to revolutionize the construction industry. After 5 years, the company was sold, and Fuller was fired as president. Now that the situation looked bleaker than ever, the family had been living well in Chicago on his salary, beyond its means. In those 5 years, he had not managed to save anything. Winter was approaching, and his prospects for work seemed very slim. His reputation was in tatters. One evening he had walked along Lake Michigan, and throughout his life up until then, he had disappointed his wife, and he had lost money for his father-in-law and his friends, who had invested in the enterprise. He was useless at business and had a burden to everyone. Finally, he decided upon suicide as the best option. He would drown himself in the lake. He had a good in structures policy, as his wife and family would take better care of her than he had been able so. As he walked toward the water, he mentally prepared himself for death. Suddenly, something stopped him in the tracks, what he would describe later as a voice coming from nearby, or perhaps within him. It would no compromise here, no way of escaping the dynamic. You will recognize how far you've divided by the depth of your pain and frustration. You must listen to the message of the frustration, this pain, and let it guide you as clearly as Fuller's voice guided him. It's a matter of life and death. The way back requires a sacrifice. You cannot have everything in the present. The road to mastery requires patience. You will have to keep your focus on 5 or 10 years down the road, when you will reap the reward of your efforts. The process of getting there, however, it is full of challenges and pleasures. Make your return to the path a resolution you set for yourself, and then tell others about it. It becomes a matter of shame and embarrassment to deviate for this path. In the end, the money and success that truly last to come, not for those who focus on such things as goals, but rather to those who focus on mastery and fulfilling their life's task. Reversal. Some people do not become aware of inclinations or future career paths in their childhood, but instead are made painfully aware of their limitations. Or they're not good at what others seem to find easy or manageable. The idea of calling in life is an alien to them. In some cases, they're internalized of the judgments and criticisms of others, and come to see themselves as essentially deficient. If they're not careful, this can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Nobody faced this faith more powerful than Temple Garden. In 1950, at the age of 3, he was diagnosed with autism. She had yet to make any progress of learning language, and it was thought that she would remain her condition, and that would need to be institutionalized her entire life. But her mother wanted to try one last option before giving up. She sent Temple to such therapists who miraculously slowly managed to teach her language, which allowed her to attend school and begin to learn what other children were learning. Despite this improvement, Temple's future appeared limited at best. Her mind functioned in a different way. She taught in terms of images, not words. In order to learn a word, she had to be able to picture it in her mind. This made it hard to understand abstract words or learning mathematics. She was also not good at socializing with other children who often made fun of her for her differences. With such learning disabilities, what could she hope to do with her life beyond some kind of mental job? To make matters worse, she had an extremely active mind, and without something to concentrate on, she would give in her feelings of intense anxiety. Whenever she felt troubled, Temple increasingly retreated to two activities that were comfortable to her: interacting with animals and building things with her hands. With animals, particularly horses, she had an uncanny ability to sense their feelings and thoughts. She became an expert horseback rider because she tended to think first in images, as it came to making things, but with her hands, like sewing or woodwork. She would envision the finished product in her mind and then easily put it together. At the age of 11, Temple went to visit an aunt who had a ranch in Arizona. There she realized that she had an average greater sense of empathy for cattle and that she did for horses. One day she watched with particular interest as some of the cattle were placed in a squeeze chute that pressed them on their sides to relax them before their vacation shots. Throughout her childhood, Temple had desire to be held tightly, but could not stand being held by any adult. She felt like she had no control in such a situation and would panic. She pleaded with her aunt to allow her to put into the squeeze device herself. Her aunt agreed, and for 30 minutes Temple gave in to the feeling of pleasure she had always dreamed of. Once it was over, she felt an enormous sense of calmness. After that experience, she became obsessed with the machine, and several years later she managed to build her own primitive version that she could use at home. Now that she was obsessed with the subject of cattle, squeeze chutes, and the effort of touch the pleasure of autistic children, in order to satisfy her curiosity, she had to develop reading and researching skills. Once she did, she found she had an unusually high powers of concentration. She would read for hours on one subject without getting the slightest bit bored. Her research slowly expanded into books on physiology, biology, and science in general. Because of the intellectual skills she had developed, she had admitted into a university. Her horizons were slowly expanding. Several years later, she found herself pursuing a master's degree in animal science in Arizona State University. There, her obsession with cattle resurfaced. She wanted to do a detailed analysis on field lots and cattle shoes in particular to help her understand the behavioral responses in animals. Her professor there could not understand such an interest and told her it was not possible. Never being one to take no for an answer, she found professors, another department, who would sponsor her. She did her study and in the process finally caught a glimpse of her life's task. She was not destined for life in the university. She was a practical person who liked to build things and yet needed constant mental stimulation. She would carve out her own particular career path, starting off freelance. She offered her services to various ranches and feedlots, designing castle chuts. They were much more suited to the animal and more efficient. Slowly, with her visual sense of design and engineering, she taught herself rudiments of these business. She expanded her services to designing more human slaughterhouses and systems for managing farm animals. With this career solidly in place, she proceeded to go further. She became a writer. She returned to the university as a professor. She transformed herself into a gifted lecturer on animals and autism. Somehow she had managed to overcome all these seemingly insurmountable obscurants in her path and find her way to the life's task that suited her perfection. When you're faced with deficiencies instead of strengths and inclination, this is a strategy you must assume. Ignore your weaknesses and resist the temptation to be more like others. Instead, like Temple Garden, direct yourself towards the small things you're good at, not the dream or to make any grand plans in the future, but instead concentrate on becoming proficient at the simple and immediate skills. These will bring you confidence and become a base from which you can expand to other pursuits. Proceeding in this way, step by step, will lead you upon life's task. Understand, your life's task does not always appear to you through some grand or promising inclination. You can appear in the guise of your own deficiencies, making you focus on one or two things that you're inevitably good at. Working at these skills, you learn the value of discipline and see the rewards you get from your efforts. Like a lotus flower, your skill will expand outward from a center of strength and confidence. Do not envy those who seem to be naturally gifted. It is often a curse, as such types rarely learn the value of diligence and focus, and they pay for this later in life. This strategy applies as well to any setbacks and difficulties we may experience. In such moments, this is generally wise to stick to a few things we know and do well, and not recipients to our confidence. If something like Temple Garden, with so much against her at birth, can find her way to life's task and to mastery, means it must be a power accessible to all of us. Sooner or later, something seems to call us onto a particular path. You may remember this something as a signal calling in childhood. But when an urge out of nowhere, a fascination, a particular turn of events struck like an nucleation is what I must do. This is what I've got to have. This is who I am. If not this vivid and sure, the call may have been more gentle. Pursues in the stream in which you drifted unknowingly into a particular spot on the bank. Looking back, you sense that fate had a hand in it. Calling may be postponed, avoided, intermittently missed. It may also possess you completely. Wherever it will out, makes its claim. Extraordinary people display calling most evidentially. Perhaps that's why they fascinate. Perhaps too they're extraordinary because their calling comes through so clearly and they're so loyal to it. Extraordinary people bear the better witness because they show what ordinary mortals simply can't. We seem to have less motivation and more distraction, yet our destiny is driven by the same universal engine. Extraordinary people are not a different category. The working of this engine in them are simply more transparent. James Hillman.